Okay, I want to welcome everybody to La Mesa Conversations and La Mesa Community La Mesa Community, not activist, but advocacy. Thank you. Got to get the right name. Co-sponsored this event. This is a report that we thought would be of interest to the community. And before we get started, I just want to let you know the bathrooms are out through that door. That door is going to remain unlocked during our entire thing, so you won't get locked out. And the other thing is turn off your cell phones so they don't ring during the event. I'll do that right now. And then I'd like to just announce that we have two elected officials. We have Mayor Art Madrid, who was mayor of La Mesa for 20 plus years and looking great in his 90s. He's kind of amazing. And then we have Jack Shue, our former city council member, who's just recently. And we're trying to get a couple of other city council, especially the newly elected ones who expressed interest in this study, and they said they will listen to it later. So we're hoping to get them on board so we can bring this to city council. So with that, I would like to introduce our two moderators, Jack Shue and Wendy Mahalik, and they're going to fill you in on some of the details, history, and then they will introduce our guest speaker who's on the screen.
Who's on the screen, and I'm going to be brief because our speaker is waiting. Thanks for coming. We're here to talk about campaign finance reform and how we can make that happen in La Mesa. As you may know from the flyer, our city got a D out of the 18 cities that were identified in the report card. And there are things that we can do to definitely lift up that score. And we're going to be listening to Citizens Take Action President and founder, David Edward Burke. Thank you, David, for joining us. A quote from their website says, "In an effort to create more responsive government at the local level, Citizens Take Action, David's has created a report card that assesses cities on the strength of their campaign finance laws and the transparency of their finance data. The report card also includes recommendations for safeguards each city can put in place to protect its government from reality, appearance, and threat of corruption." In La Mesa, we've all lived through some abuses already. We've seen how developers try to curry favor with certain councilmen. We've seen how PACs distribute misleading information to voters, telling them who's a Democrat and who's not. These are all things that we can address in a very formal way with campaign finance. So I think with that, David, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk a little bit about your background and the background of your group. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It sounds like, everything good?
Turn the volume up.
Right up.
David, for some reason, we're not hearing you. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh yeah, how do I sound?
Gotcha. You're here. Not too much up.
Okay.
Let me know when you're at the sweet spot.
Go ahead.
Oh, and one last thing. We're all going to have questions. We'd like to hold the questions till David's done with his presentation. And then when you do have a question, if you're in the room here, you just raise your hand and you can speak it, or if you want to write it on a card, I'm happy to do it for you. Thank you. Okay.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm David Burke. I'm the founder of Citizens Take Action. I don't know if you can see our research director, Catherine Massey, is also on the Zoom, and she knows a lot about the work that we've done, has contributed a lot to it. So our nonprofit focuses on campaign finance reform and improving transparency in government. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you tonight. My goal is I've got, I think, maybe a 15-minute-ish presentation that will give you hopefully a clear understanding of campaign finance law, highlight some of the challenges by our broken campaign finance system, and walk you through what La Mesa can do at the local level to enact what we see as beneficial reforms. So let me try and share my screen here. And, oh, whoops. Let me share it first and then turn on the slideshow. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing I want to walk through is just the big picture, legally speaking, of American campaign finance law. I'm not going to try and go into amazing depth, but I want to give you what we consider the four major pillars of campaign finance law. And these were all essentially formed through Supreme Court decisions. So every legislator from Congress to the municipal level has to work within these parameters when they're deciding what campaign finance reforms they can enact. The first major pillar is that campaign contribution limits are legal. That's money given directly to a candidate's campaign. And this was decided in a 1976 case called Buckley v. Vallejo, where the Supreme Court recognized a sufficiently important interest in the prevention of corruption and the appearance of corruption. And they found that campaign contribution limits served that interest. And so that stood in place for almost 50 years. The second pillar is that limits on limits on independent expenditures, which is money that is not given directly to a candidate's campaign, but that is used to support them independently, are illegal. And in that same 1976 decision, the Supreme Court held that those didn't pose the same risk of quid pro quo corruption as campaign contribution limits. So they said you can limit independent expenditures. And that was expanded upon in the Citizens United decision in 2010, which took that and applied it to corporations and unions. So after that, individuals, corporations, and unions could spend unlimited amounts of money to influence elections through independent expenditures. The last two major pillars have been developed through a series of Supreme Court decisions. So I'm not going to hone in on any one in detail. But the third pillar is that publicly financed elections are generally legal. And those are elections in which candidates receive some public money to campaign. As long as those are optional rather than mandatory, the Supreme Court tends to allow those. The last major pillar is that disclosure requirements are also legal under most circumstances. The court has repeatedly recognized that disclosure serves a number of compelling interests, including helping voters evaluate candidates for office, deterring corruption and the appearance of corruption, and helping identify illegal activity. So that's the framework we have to work within. It's not the framework I would personally design if I could, but that's what the Supreme Court has given us. And it poses a lot of challenges for how our current system works. So let me touch on those, and then we'll zero in on the local government level. Some of the major challenges are that the reality and appearance of pay-to-play politics still exists. Studies show that large campaign contributors typically gain more access to elected officials, and that legislation tends to go in their favor over time. At the federal level, it may be pharmaceutical companies and big tech that are spending the most. At the local level, you already touched on this in your intro, it's more commonly real estate developers, labor unions, or waste management companies that are spending very heavily to influence elections. Polls show that around 80% of Americans believe campaign donors have too much influence over elected officials, and the data bears that out. A second challenge is excessive influence from outside the jurisdiction. Our system allows for campaigns to be funded primarily or almost entirely from people or businesses that don't live in the city or the relevant jurisdiction. And having studied cities throughout California, I can tell you that it's common to see a city where 80% or 90% or more of the money came from outside that jurisdiction. That troubles a lot of people who would prefer that the residents who are being represented are primarily the ones who fund campaigns. A third challenge is that our system greatly favors wealthier candidates who can afford to self-finance or who have close ties to special interests. That tends to make for a less diverse group of viable candidates. And if you look at cities throughout California and city councils, you tend to see that certain age groups and demographics are much more likely to be represented. These problems decrease public trust. The perception of undue influence decreases the public's trust in government, and it discourages public participation because residents don't feel like they can necessarily influence the process the way that a special interest can. So in sum, the vast majority of Americans believe our campaign finance laws make it too easy for special interests to buy influence. As a result, they have less trust in government and are deterred from participating in the process. And given that democracy really depends on a critical mass of resident citizens being informed and engaged, that's alarming. So the question we're trying to answer is, how can we work within the legal parameters that exist to address those challenges? To help answer that question, we created report cards that grade cities on the strength of their campaign finance laws and the transparency of campaign finance data. The goal was to assess where cities stand, offer recommendations for reforms, and we've published report cards for 7 counties in California, and we're hoping to get to all of them in the not too distant future. So let me walk you through these report cards and the different criteria we use, which there's 8 total. And then for each criterion, I'll go over 4 things. Our standard recommendation, overall findings, so you get a sense of how common certain reforms are, the status in La Mesa specifically, and examples from high-scoring cities that we think do things well. The first major area we focus on in our report card is campaign finance. And with that, we look at whether a city has enacted any limits on campaign contributions by individuals or political action committees to candidates. There's a default limit set by the state of California that's now $5,900. We think that's extremely high. For context, 24 states have contribution limits for their governor's races that are under $5,900. So right now, someone running for city council in La Mesa can get larger campaign contributions than someone running for governor of Colorado or Massachusetts. Our recommendation is a limit of $1,000 or less on individuals and PACs. And you often want to adjust these for inflation because prices go up over time. Obviously, the less an individual or PAC can contribute to a campaign or a candidate, the less perception or reality of buying influence. And so lower campaign contributions can give residents more confidence that their elected officials are looking out for them over special interests. In terms of overall findings, for 2 sizable counties, in Orange County, 15 of 34 cities have enacted their own campaign contribution limits. The average limit was $143. In San Diego County, as of when we published this, 13 of 18 cities had limits they enacted, and the average was $535. In La Mesa, you have not enacted any of your own, so the $5,900 limit is what applies. We also looked at some cities with medium to small populations that are fairly comparable to La Mesa's size. And you can see this chart showing their limits on individuals and PACs. Often the limit for individuals and PACs is identical. And I think the big takeaway from this is that there are plenty of cities that have limits in the $500 to $1,000 range that are comparable to La Mesa. The next criteria we considered was whether a city has enacted any limit or prohibition on contractors or developers, because this addresses the pay-to-play issue with general campaign contribution limits by targeting the parties that are directly doing business with the city because they want a city contract or they want a development project approved. Our recommendation was a limit of $500 or less for the 6 months or maybe 12 months before or after consideration of the item coming before the council. Interestingly, after we published our first report card, a state law enacted similar requirements. It was a SB 1439, and it's been adjusted once or twice since then. But essentially, it has some recusal requirements for council members who get a certain amount of money. I believe it's maybe $500 or more from a contractor or developer during a relevant time period. There are some loopholes in the state law. I believe it exempts competitively bid contracts and labor unions. In our view, those are some pretty big loopholes. So we'd recommend limit without those loopholes. In La Mesa, you haven't enacted any sort of unique prohibition or limit. And if you want to know what high scoring cities did, Coronado and National City have both enacted a prohibition on contributions by prospective city contractors from the start of negotiations to the completion of performance or the end of negotiations. The last criteria we looked at for campaign finance was whether a city has a fundraising window, just a limited time period during which candidates can raise money for their election. And our recommendation was a window of 1 year or less prior to the next election. Only a few cities we've studied have enacted these, but they do exist. And in cities La Mesa's size, it's common that candidates won't raise money for more than a year in advance of an election anyway. So I wouldn't think that this should necessarily get too much pushback if it were proposed. But as an example of what a city in San Diego County does, Chula Vista has a window that's 11 months before the election. Essentially, January 1st of the year the election takes place is when candidates can start raising money. In addition to these recommended reforms, as we've studied more cities, we found some cities have enacted other ideas that we thought were interesting or worth consideration. Some cities limit contributions by political parties. Some limit contributions or prohibit contributions from one candidate to another. Some limit loans from a candidate to their own campaign. So those are other options that a city can consider. And then something really special and important and great that I want to highlight or mention is publicly financed elections. In my opinion, these are the best way to amplify the voice of residents in a given city in terms of campaign finance. And this is a system in which candidates who meet certain criteria, like a certain number of donations or signatures, are eligible to receive at least some public funding for their campaign. For example, a candidate who raises at least $1,000 total from 20 different donors might get a 5 times match of whatever they raise from the city. Or they might get a lump sum of $25,000 from the city to fund their campaign. These exist in states like those that you see listed on the slide. There are some cities as well in California. Oakland has it, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Seattle, Baltimore, Denver. There's different types of these. There's vouchers, there's matching funds, there's lump sums. But I consider these the gold standard if you want to improve public trust, minimize the risk of pay-to-play politics, and give hardworking candidates who might not be independently wealthy a chance to succeed. So that largely covers the campaign finance portion of our report. Let's turn to the transparency section. And what we mean by transparency in this report is openness regarding the money behind local elections. So we believe residents should be easily able to access data on campaign contributions and independent expenditures, so you know exactly who is spending money to influence your local candidates. It helps you be more informed voters. It gives you confidence that decisions are not tainted by conflicts of interest. And if cities don't provide this information, it makes it seem like they're hiding something. We assess cities on a few different criteria here. The first was whether they post the relevant Fair Political Practices Commission forms on the city website that show campaign contributions and independent expenditures. We also looked at how easy these are to access. Does it take 5 link clicks Or is it buried somewhere? No one can find it on the city's website? Or is it very easy to find? Is there a link on the homepage that says campaign finance disclosures? And then we also judge cities on the thoroughness of data, meaning how far do they go back? We recommend going back 4 election cycles or 8 years. That often covers every sitting elected official. And that way you can see the complete history for the people on your dais. Overall, most cities and counties we study have posted at least some of the relevant forms on their website, and it's generally not too difficult to find. Cities tend to score lower in thoroughness of data. In Orange County, only 13 cities posted data going back at least 4 election cycles. In San Diego, it was about half of the cities. In La Mesa, you did pretty well in terms of having the forms present on the website. And there was a link from the homepage. You just have to find the city clerk tab, and then the disclosures are available through there. So that was solid overall. The data only goes back to 2020, which isn't quite as far as we recommend. There's some other, oh, and I apologize. Here's the slide showing it. So on the La Mesa City website, that's where the link to disclosures is. And then you use this net file system, which looks like this. And then you can click on the various candidates, elections, independent expenditures. And then, for example, independent expenditures in your recent election showed up as this. And there's a bunch of different forms filed by this labor coalition that spend a good amount of money. I also think there's some really interesting, important things you can do additionally in terms of transparency. So one is to disclose or improve disclosure by requiring disclosure of the true identity behind independent expenditures. And so that means if there's a PAC called like the Wonderful Neighborhood PAC, a requirement that the top 3 funders of that PAC have to be listed on any mailer or digital advertisement sent out by the PAC can really help avoid the dark money problem and help voters see who is actually funding the advertisements they're receiving. Another idea is to have an additional pre-election filing for candidates, because the way it works now, most of the money that's spent in the last month or two before an election doesn't have to be disclosed by the candidate's campaign until a month or two after the election. So a candidate might spend $20,000 on last minute mailers, and you wouldn't find out who contributed to them or any information about it until January, even though the election was November. So some cities have enacted an additional filing deadline saying like 3 or 5 days before election day, you have to file a form showing these last minute contributions and expenditures. When you combine both the campaign finance and transparency components, that's how we came up with our overall grades. You can see the breakdown here across Orange County and San Diego County. I think that overall, San Diego is one of the better performing counties we've studied. It was better than Orange County, although you can see La Mesa's grade, which was not one of the better ones in San Diego County. A couple things I find interesting about this or noteworthy. First is that getting an A is achievable. We didn't set an impossible standard. I think if a city enacts beneficial reforms, it's well within reach to get a good grade based on our report card. The second thing you'll notice is there's lots of A's or D's and F's, but not many B's and C's. And that's essentially because cities fall into 2 groups most of the time. Either they have never, ever passed a single ordinance pertaining to campaign finance, in which case they probably got a D or an F, or they have passed a fairly thorough campaign finance reform ordinance, in which case they probably got an A. So that's why you see that kind of discrepancy. Well, Mesa's grade is a reflection of the fact that they scored very low because they hadn't pass any campaign finance ordinance, but they did reasonably well in transparency. And so that got the D grade. Here's a menu of options that we recommend you consider in La Mesa. It's not written in any particular order. These are just particular options that we think you and elected officials would want to consider in terms of how can we improve transparency? How can we limit undue influence by special interests in our city? And we would be happy to work with you in any capacity to try and help move these forward. I think that about concludes my presentation. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share this with you. I want to thank you for, as a group, getting together and considering reforms like this. I know, so one thing I didn't mention, I'm actually an elected official myself. I was elected to the city council in Cypress, California in 2022, and I became the mayor of Cypress this year. I know how hard it is to find a dedicated, engaged group of citizens. And so I really appreciate those of you who have come out and who are active in your community and considering reforms like this. So with that said, thank you so much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I will stop my screen share.
What's the cards?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have two questions. I was looking into a couple of council members at some point, back before it was on the website, and you had to get the records requests and stuff. And so two things I noticed, I was wondering if there's ways to mitigate this or combat this, is several contributions from people aligned to the same organization. So this person, this council member had the company, the founders of the company, the board from the company, and several other people, all individually contributing the max. So one company then contributed, who happened to be up in front of the council later that year, contributed a ton of money. So is there a way to stop that combining? And then the second thing I saw, same council member, as a matter of fact, was that there was crossover between his day job and contributions to his day job and his work, and then his contributions to his own campaign. So he'd be talking to contributors of his, if it was a nonprofit, which is what he said, it made it acceptable. He would be asking for contributions to his nonprofit that is under his name, as opposed to his campaign, and then they'd be double doing that. So I was wondering if there's any ways to mitigate those type of circumstances.
Good questions. Yeah, you've done your homework. So my answer is yes, there are. In terms of the first question with like a company and its employee and their spouse or whatever, all contributing, I've seen some cities where I think they've enacted like a definition of maybe what's allowed as a contribution from an entity. But in that definition, it might say, this means the entity, this means their employees, this means their CEO. And so that would be a way potentially to stop the problem or mitigate the problem you're describing. And then some of you probably know the second issue you're describing with a council member soliciting contributions to their nonprofit is that's called behested payments. And I believe that some cities have enacted limits on those, or I know for a fact some cities have enacted significant disclosure requirements about those. But I suspect there might be cities that have enacted some limits, or at least maybe some like recusal requirements related to that. So yeah, there are things that you can do in that area. And I don't have the full answer on the behested payments, but I've seen other cities mention that. I know the city of Los Angeles has had some issues pertaining to that. And so they have some rules in place, I think.
David, I have several questions from the audience that I'm going to read on their behalf. And I'm going to preface one of them on public finance by saying that I'm assuming that all of these reforms, with the exception of the public finance option, can be done with our city council, that we don't have to go to the voters to request permission to do those things. But the public option would be financing. And so the question is, where does the public money come from?
Okay, so that's a good question. On whether your city can do that, it actually depends. I don't know if La Mesa is a general law city or a charter city.
General law.
Okay. Well, the state of California has a bad law in place, in my opinion, that I don't think general law cities can currently enact publicly financed elections. I think if you just do a search, this issue is currently being considered by either the state legislature or the governor. So you're right that it might not just be something you could enact right now. Where the money comes from, some of it comes from, well, I won't overcomplicate it. It comes from the city's general fund often. So it comes from residents' tax dollars. And so you do run into the argument sometimes, I don't want my tax dollars being used to support, this candidate that I don't support. And I understand, I guess, that sentiment. But on the other hand, if it means your city's 80% funded by residents and their tax dollars, or your city's elections are funded by residents and their tax dollars versus two developers and a waste management company, I personally think that's a trade-off most residents would take. And these don't have to be prohibitively expensive either. So on a per resident basis, it might be, 1 to 3 of your tax dollars goes toward publicly financed elections.
Okay, another question from the audience. Our police and fire department unions both give the $5,900 state limit, because that's what La Mesa is doing, to their chosen city council candidates. Can we expect pushback from those two unions to affect campaign finance reform?
Yes, they can both give the max contributions. And I don't know that I would particularly expect pushback from them because they already spend typically a lot through independent expenditures. And so this brings up a thornier question that maybe someone in the room is thinking, or I'll just pose because I know council members ask this. Well, if we enact campaign contribution limits, won't more money just come from independent expenditures? And is that worse because it's outside or potentially less easy to track? But my short answer to that is no, I don't think so. If you enact contribution limits, a lot of people who are making those large limits or making large contributions will not set up some new PAC to get around it. But the groups that already spend a lot of money through IEs, like the unions you mentioned or developers, they're going to keep doing it just because that's what the Supreme Court has allowed them to do.
And yet some cities in San Diego County have banned PACs altogether.
You're right. So they've banned the direct campaign contributions by PACs, but they can't ban the independent expenditures.
Okay, and we have another question from the audience. How does one prove undue influence on a city council member?
Well, that's a good question. So in terms of can you prove it, like you can prove that my shirt is blue? Probably not. But what you can do is notice, I don't know, how do I explain this, right? You can't really prove that pharmaceutical companies have had undue influence in the United States and our legislative decisions. But if you look at how much pharmaceutical companies spend and how American prescription drug prices are higher than almost every other comparable country, I feel like it's a logical conclusion. And I think it's the same thing with cities. When you look at council members, they all got hefty support from this trash company. But the trash company wasn't the lowest bidder for the trash contract, and they all picked them anyway. That's the best you're going to do. But I feel like it's the kind of thing that most reasonable people look at and say, okay, I see what's going on here. It can't just be a coincidence that whoever spends a lot of money gets what they want over and over again.
Go ahead.
I have a question. So my question is, although on its face value, I have no problem with prohibiting developers. However, I guess I'm wondering why would that be necessary if you give these limits? And would it, I guess I worry that there would be businesses that would say, well, you know, why would you stop this business from contributing, but these businesses can? It doesn't seem fair. And so I guess I'm wondering why the cap, like you're limiting how much one entity can contribute. Why would you need to prohibit a business? So I'm just kind of curious.
My compliments to this group. You're a smart crowd. So you actually caught something that I forgot to mention in my presentation. The limits or prohibitions on contractors and developers are really important or much more important in cities that haven't enacted their own limits. But if you enact a $750 limit on contributions by individuals and PACs, I don't think you really need a separate one on contractors or developers. It's more for if a city hasn't enacted anything and you're going to focus on parties who are really trying to exert influence, that's when you want the limit or prohibition on contractors or developers. But if you just enact a $500 to $1,000 limit tomorrow on individuals and PACs, that's great. And I don't think it's necessary to do a separate one.
Hold on, Jean.
Thank you. Could you give us some suggestions? We've come to this point now, and suggestions that you've seen from other cities that the way they developed campaign finance reform. What are the next steps we should do after this? Some suggestions would be really welcome.
Yeah, well, this depends a lot on the makeup of your city council and what it's taken in other cities, or most cities I've seen do this recently. You need one or two council members who are genuinely interested and willing to push this forward. And then you work with them. You advocate for these reforms at meetings. You see if somebody like me can come give a presentation to the council and answer their questions about the nitty gritty, or suggest helping draft an ordinance so we make it easy for them. Of course, showing up, and even if you don't have those one or two council members right now who may be on board with this, it doesn't hurt to show up to meetings, to email them, to contact them and try and see where they're at. I mean, at the very least, even council members who I know who won't enact limits, at least see the merits of some of these transparency measures. And then, of course, if it's a longer term thing where you don't have the votes right now, make it an issue in the upcoming election and ask candidates running for city council, where do you stand on this, and support the ones who do. So that's my advice, is find an ally or two on the council and then get the word out as much as you can. I have another suggestion now that I'm thinking. Another important thing is, you mentioned, I think in the introduction, right, a history in La Mesa with developers, or with, I gather, with behested payments from what I recall and things like that. I mean, how many of your residents know about that? Is it something that's gotten a lot of news coverage? Is it something people talk about in the Facebook groups? Or is it something you can help spread the word about? Because if residents don't know about it, there's not going to be as much organic demand for it. But if you help raise awareness that, hey, this is a problem here in La Mesa, you can build even more groundswell of support.
Actually, David, you mentioned one of the specifics in your report card, in the write-up on La Mesa, so you nailed it. And everyone who, if you haven't read the report, it's 20 pages, it's well worth reading. It's very, very informative. So you had a question.
Yeah, do these changes need to go through a public vote, or can it be enacted by the council themselves?
Most likely it can just be enacted by the council itself. Unless, yeah, you're a general law city, so yeah, you can just the council can enact all of these reforms on their own, except for publicly financed elections.
I can add to that, though. If it is enacted by a council ordinance, it can be changed by the council. If it is acted upon by a measure on the ballot,
It's gonna be changed.
then it has only to be changed by another vote by the general voters again. So there's a power issue. If it's acted upon by the council takes its merry time.
Yeah.
I
As
won't
we
get-
know, former council member.
Whereas if it's acted by the people, the city has to take action. It goes into law within whatever specified time that measure had on the ballot.
And there's nothing preventing you from trying to parallel path and do both, so get the council to enact something while you're waiting on getting the vote and writing the ordinance.
There's a difference in cost. If you could do it by the council, you just need to convince your council.
Yeah.
And we'll deal with strategies on that in a moment. If you do put it on the ballot, then you have to essentially run a campaign, and even the cheapest campaigns cost some money.
But you gotta get some developers to help you on it.
Exactly.
We've got 3 open seats in 2026, 3. So, it's time to act is now.
I know.
Go ahead, Ms. Green.
Good.
What's your experience in campaign contributions with general law cities and at large, and then district cities with district elections?
That's a good question. Let me touch on Jack's point real quick. So he's right. There's a city in Orange County, Huntington Beach, California. When we issued our report card, they got an A. I think they had a $620 campaign contribution limit. A new council came in, they just got rid of every campaign finance reform they'd enacted. They went to, I think, a D or an F. So the council can always change it. And I have seen cities, the city of Alhambra is one we mentioned in our report card. They passed a comprehensive ballot measure like this, and it passed with, I think, over 70% of the vote. I think a big challenge, though, is getting it on the ballot. In terms of at-large versus districts, so districts are definitely cheaper for a candidate, right? A candidate running in a district almost always spends less money than a candidate running citywide. However, per dollar per vote, districts are a little bit more expensive. So what I mean by that is, in my city, it might take $40,000 or $50,000 to win in an at-large election. And once we're in 5 districts, it might take more like $20,000 or $25,000. So it's not a perfect correlation of it takes 1/5 as much in districts or 1/7 as it does at large. But districts are definitely cheaper that large. And on a personal note, as a candidate, I just like the ability to have a district that's small enough where I can actually knock on every door, as opposed to a city where it's so big, it's just unrealistic to connect with most of the voters.
On Jack's point, that having the council create an ordinance versus taking it and getting it on the ballot. If it goes on the ballot, it won't be written by the council and decided by the council, the limits. But if it goes on the ballot, depending on who wrote it up, it could be a lot leaner, so to speak, with the limitations. And that would also make the ballot potentially better way to go, right?
Well, if you do the ballot, you're more likely to get, if you're able to get the signatures to get something on the ballot, then you could craft it much more bespoke to what your ideal is, right? Provided that it doesn't go so far that it turns people off, because that's not what you want to do. Whereas if you go through the council, you're probably much more likely to get less than the ideal, but a compromise that's in a big improvement, but maybe not everything you'd like to get through on a ballot initiative.
David, maybe I missed this, but I did not see city by city in the report card how they got their limits. So do you specify in there whether they did a ballot measure or whether this was council initiated or that for the San Diego County cities?
No, we didn't do that. And to the best of my knowledge, it's almost always through the council. Ballot initiatives are pretty rare on this just because it's easier to get 3 or 4 council members to support something than it is to gather all the signatures needed, depending on what your city's rules are, to get something on the ballot.
Yeah, this is more of a local question, but have there been any efforts in the past, and maybe you can answer this, to enact any of these reforms in La Mesa?
Good question.
Has it ever even come up?
Yes, but there's always a few who say no way.
Okay, so from
On
a
the
council,
council?
Well, from my understanding is that the state baseline didn't really go into effect until 2021. So that $5,900 limit has just, or whatever it was initially, just happened.
Doesn't happen.
For the state. So I don't know what we had,
That's correct.
what did we have before? Nothing. I think
Before, anyone could give me as much money as they wanted to, it was okay. But now, you know, maybe that's why I'm not running again.
another question, if I may.
yes.
Maybe it's just me, but was this report published like in our local newspaper or?
Should be.
We
It
should.
it got written about by at least one local paper in San Diego, one of the sizable ones, and the report is available on our website for anybody to see if you want it.
I
Look at
think
it.
a local article would be like the La Mesa Courier. I mean,
Yeah, right.
might get to more
Let's
homes.
just get on that. Because it's easy to do. Just do a link in the report. It's fantastic. It really is.
One question I have is, so let's say you did the ordinance because you can get it done quicker and maybe with less pain. But if you go with ordinance, you get people who are coming in to agree to it. Can you put a sort of provision in the ordinance that says that if a subsequent council comes in and wants to get rid of it, that they have to give certain amount of public notice? They have to do it within like 6 months of voting. They have to do that. If you put that into the ordinance, then they can't just do it like under the cover of darkness sort of thing. I don't know.
That's probably, I think Jack might be better suited to answer that than I am. It's
I don't
sort
know.
of based on what your local rules are, but what do you think, Jack?
I think if you did that, they might find a way to get around that anyway. Because it has to do with, you know, one council isn't any stronger than another council. So if a former council did something, they really can't restrict the next council to take action. And the next council may find some good reason to override what passed. But council just can't override the people.
Right.
But they can override the former council all the time.
How do you enforce these laws? Because, for example, if we put a law that you have to recuse yourself if there's some conflict of interest, but the city attorney doesn't enforce it, or like, how does it get enforced actually?
So when you pass one of these ordinances, you can include enforcement mechanisms in there, whether it's the city attorney or giving residents the power to forward information to a grand jury or a local district attorney, something like that. So cities can build their own enforcement mechanisms in. And I've seen everything from like an ethics commission to the city attorney to the district attorney. So that's something that cities figure out on their own.
A few years ago, we had 3 candidates that teamed up and they pooled their resources. They put up a big billboard with the 3 of them on it. And is there anything that can restrict candidates from doing that kind of thing?
With the mail.
to make the most of their money, so to speak?
I don't think I've seen anything like that. Catherine, have you seen anything like that? No, I don't. That's just common smart campaigning.
Yeah, it's slave mailers do that.
Better jump in.
Yeah, oh, I had a question. Maybe you covered it and I was looking at something else. The bonus column on your report. Did you cover the bonus column?
The bonus column is for anything that really kind of went above and beyond in terms of the reforms that we recommended. So if a city had like exceptionally low campaign contribution limits, if their transparency was really standout good, if they had an additional disclosure requirement or filing deadline, if they have publicly financed elections, that's the kind of stuff that's covered by our bonus column.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of shame, I mean, if you have strong disclosure laws of where the money comes from and a certain vote for a project by a developer comes up, you can connect the dots and basically go public with it. I mean, so in a sense, that can be as strong a tool as having campaign donation limits in one sense. I mean, one could make an argument for that. I mean, that is evidence to show that someone got all this money, you know. I mean, J.D. Vance got elected by Peter Thiel money. I mean, that's common knowledge. Now, do the voters of Ohio, if he, you know, if he would have stayed in the Senate, knowing that, unvote him in, you know, 6 years, you know, after he was elected? I mean, at a certain point, there may be not much you can do except trusting people to do in the public interest. Because again, people will find loopholes around certain things to do venal things and try and get away with it. If the matter is finding it and exposing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And don't underestimate all of your ability in the room to do that. You could start, I mean, there's in Orange County, there's a guy who has a blog. He posts screenshots of the campaign contributions and connects them to the votes. In my city, people post, you know, a little newsletter in the Facebook group revealing some of this information. And sadly, with the decline of local journalism, that's more essential than ever. So don't underestimate how one or two people who just dig into this info and share it with the public can change the perception in your city.
Thank you very much, David. We're getting close to time. If there are other questions you want to get in, let's do it right this second. Oh, hold on. Actually, I'm going to go to Mike.
I was just wondering if there are many watchdog groups within cities that have passed these ordinances or contribution limits.
I haven't seen much of that. I see occasional bloggers, usually, you know, watchdog group. Usually what it is one or two concerned citizens who are just paying attention to this stuff.
Okay, you're gonna have the last word.
Okay, real quick, it's peripherally related, and I thought that was gonna be just discussed today, but have you looked into the issue of excess campaign mailers that flood our homes during this process, and we have no control over that, from my understanding?
Yeah. It's not fun, but well, I'll tell you this fact that maybe you can share with people. I don't know if you all know what slate mailers are. I see Jack nodding his head. So slate mailers are like these mailers with pictures of 8 or 10, you know, candidates supported on it. It's from like the San Diego tax slayers or the public safety superstars or whatever. The thing that I didn't know until I became a candidate myself is that these aren't based on any endorsement or criteria whatsoever. You just pay to be on them. So if you want to spread the word, one thing I try and tell people is you could do a lot worse than throwing away any mailer you get from a local political campaign, but at the very least, completely ignore the slate mailers and only look at the mailers, funded by like the candidate themselves and try and verify the information, because you just can't trust the source or what that is trying to tell you. And then, so one last thing, I'm so bad at this, but Citizens Take Action is a nonprofit. Thank you so much for having me and asking such good questions. And please let's stay in touch and let us know what we can do to help you in La Mesa. And if you appreciated this presentation and you want to support our work, we're funded by individual donors like you. So you can go to citizenstakeaction.org and donate. It would mean a lot to us. And my email for anybody is just david@citizenstakeaction.org. So if you want to reach out in the future with questions or to talk things through, please don't hesitate to reach out.
The donation limits?
And yeah, no contribution limits, right? To your site.
I had to catch it, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening, and please stay in touch, and hopefully we can work together to move forward on some reforms in La Mesa.
We're gonna compare notes and talk about next steps, and we'll be in touch for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.